In the winter of 1893, a London coroner recorded the death of a woman named Clara Fenwick. She was 34 years old. The cause of death listed on the form was 2 words: accidental poisoning. The inquest lasted less than an hour. No witnesses were called from the chemist's shop on Cheapside, where Clara had purchased 3 separate bottles in the 7 days before she died. No one asked why the bottles were empty. No one asked who had prescribed them, or whether anyone had. The coroner signed the form, set down his pen, and moved on to the next case on his desk. There were 4 more that week with nearly identical circumstances. Clara Fenwick was not a scandal. She was a statistic. And the statistic, by 1893, had grown so large that it had stopped registering as anything unusual at all. Here is the number that should stop everything. By the early 1890s, 1 in every 5 women in Victorian Britain was consuming laudanum on a daily basis. Not as a recreational indulgence, not as a desperate act of self-destruction, as medicine, prescribed by doctors, sold by chemists, recommended by neighbours, administered by mothers to their own children. A brown glass bottle with a cork stopper, sitting on the shelf between the candles and the kitchen salt, as unremarkable as anything else in the house. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. 1 in 5. In a country of 30 million people, with roughly half of them women, that figure represents millions of individual lives shaped around a single substance. Millions of mornings that began not with breakfast or prayer, but with a measured dose in a small glass of water. Millions of women who could not have told you, if asked directly, whether they were taking it because they needed it, or because stopping had become unthinkable. And laudanum was not expensive. That is the detail that changes everything. A penny a dose at most chemists, cheaper than a pint of beer, cheaper than a candle, available without a prescription at any of the thousands of chemist shops operating across England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. A working woman in a Manchester cotton mill could afford it on her daily wage. A destitute widow in a London tenement could afford it. The price point was not accidental. It meant the market was not limited to the wealthy, to the educated, to those with access to physicians. It meant the market was everyone. The bottle Clara Fenwick kept on her dressing table was labelled, as most were, with the name of the preparation and the recommended dose. 20 drops in water, twice daily. What the label did not say, what no label in Britain was legally required to say, was that the primary ingredient was liquid opium dissolved in alcohol, and that the human body, given enough time and enough doses, would restructure itself around that substance in ways that made stopping feel physically impossible. Nobody told Clara this. Nobody told most of the women who were taking it. The word addiction was not yet in common medical usage. The concept that a prescribed medicine could enslave the body of the person taking it. This idea existed in scattered medical journals and private correspondence between physicians, but it had not reached the chemist's counter, the doctor's waiting room, or the drawing rooms of Birmingham and Edinburgh and Bristol, where women were measuring out their drops every morning with the same calm routine they brought to everything else in their lives. The scale of what happened between roughly 1820 and 1920 in Britain and the United States is difficult to hold in a single thought. More people developed opiate dependency through legitimate medical prescription in those 100 years than would die in the First World War. More women were chemically dependent on laudanum at the height of its use than were employed in all of Britain's factories combined. The numbers are not metaphors. They are counts of actual people, most of whom left no record beyond a coroner's entry or a census notation of invalid or unwell. But numbers alone don't explain how it happened. They don't explain why it was women. They don't explain why the doctors who prescribed it, and the chemists who sold it, and the manufacturers who produced it, and the governments who regulated, or failed to regulate, it all seemed to look in a slightly different direction at exactly the same moment for exactly the same 100 years. Clara Fenwick's inquest record is still held in the London Metropolitan Archives. The coroner's handwriting is clear and practiced. The form is filled out correctly. At the bottom, in the space reserved for remarks, he wrote nothing. The case was closed. What was never written on that form, what nobody in that room in 1893 had the language to write, was the question that sits at the centre of everything that follows. Laudanum was created by a celebrated physician as a gift to suffering humanity. It was endorsed by the finest medical minds in Europe for 3 centuries. It was sold legally, taxed legally, prescribed legally, and consumed by millions of women who were told, explicitly and repeatedly, that it was helping them. So how did it become this? The story begins not in a Victorian pharmacy, not in an English drawing room, but in a Swiss mountain town in the 1520s, in the laboratory of a man who went by a name he'd given himself, Paracelsus. His real name was Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. The fact that he replaced it says something about him. He was not a man who accepted inherited structures, including his own identity. He burned the textbooks of Galen and Avicenna in public bonfires at the University of Basel, not out of theatrical impulse, but because he had tested their methods and found them lethal. In the 16th century, that made him a radical. It also made him right. Medicine in 1520 was a landscape of organised harm. Physicians bled patients to rebalance humours that didn't exist. They induced vomiting with antimony compounds that destroyed the stomach lining. They packed infected wounds with poultices of pigeon dung and vinegar. Pain was not something medicine treated. It was something medicine ignored while addressing the presumed spiritual or humoral imbalance beneath it. Patients died not only from their diseases but routinely from the treatments applied to those diseases. Paracelsus believed in a different approach. Chemistry, not tradition. Observation, not inherited authority. He wanted a measurable substance that produced a measurable effect in a measurable dose. He wanted something that actually stopped suffering. What he reached for was opium. Opium was not new. That is the first thing to understand. The Sumerians were cultivating the poppy plant in Mesopotamia as early as 3400 BC, calling it Hul-Gil, the joy plant. Egyptian medical papyri from 1500 BC describe poppy preparations for quieting crying children. Greek physicians used it. Roman surgeons carried it. Arab traders spread it across the known world for 1,000 years before Paracelsus was born. The raw substance, the dried latex scraped from the seed pod of Papaver somniferum, had been easing pain and inducing sleep for longer than any civilization had been keeping written records. But raw opium was inconsistent. Its potency varied by harvest, by region, by how it was processed. Taken as a solid or smoked, its effects were unpredictable and its dosing impossible to control with any precision. Paracelsus did something that sounds almost mundane but changed everything. He dissolved it in alcohol. The resulting liquid was stable, consistent, and far more potent than anything that had come before. Alcohol accelerated the absorption of opium's active compounds into the bloodstream. The effect was faster, stronger, and more controllable than raw opium had ever been. Paracelsus named the preparation laudanum, from the Latin laudar, to praise. The name was not ironic. He genuinely believed he had created something worth celebrating. He was not entirely wrong. In a world without anesthesia, without antibiotics, without any reliable method of managing acute pain, laudanum was transformative. A soldier with a shattered limb, a woman in prolonged labour, a child with intestinal cramping so severe it had kept an entire household awake for a week. For all of them, laudanum worked in a way that nothing else in a 16th century physician's cabinet could match. It quieted pain, it induced sleep, it slowed the violent spasms of dysentery and cholera that killed more people in that era than most weapons did. Paracelsus documented his formulation carefully. He documented its effects carefully. And then he wrote something that his successors would spend 3 centuries pretending they hadn't read. In his own records, he noted that laudanum produced a state of dependence in patients who used it regularly, that the body seemed to require increasing amounts to achieve the same relief, and that stopping abruptly caused a distinct and severe physical reaction. He didn't have the biochemistry to explain why, but he saw it. He wrote it down. The warning existed from the first moment the substance existed. Nobody acted on it. For 100 years after Paracelsus, laudanum remained a specialist preparation, expensive, rare, known primarily to physicians and apothecaries who mixed their own formulations. It was powerful but inaccessible, which limited both its benefits and its damage. Then, in 1660, a physician in London began the process of turning a specialist compound into an everyday product. Thomas Sydenham was called the English Hippocrates by his contemporaries, and the title was not flattery. It was accurate assessment. He was among the most careful clinical observers of his generation, a physician who insisted on watching disease progress in real patients rather than theorizing about it from classical texts. He kept meticulous records. He modified treatments based on outcomes rather than doctrine. In almost every respect, he was the model of responsible medical practice for his era. He was also laudanum's most effective promoter. Sydenham reformulated the preparation, adding saffron, cinnamon and cloves to improve its flavour and palatability. He systematized its dosing, and then he began prescribing it, not just for severe pain, not just for crisis situations, but for cough, for diarrhea, for insomnia, for what he described as nervous complaints, for grief, for anxiety, for the general category of suffering he called low spirits. He called laudanum one of the most valued medicines in the world, a phrase that appeared in medical literature for the next 200 years, reproduced without question in textbook after textbook across Britain, France, Germany, and the American colonies. His endorsement was not reckless by the standards of his time. The alternatives, mercury compounds, bloodletting, purging, were genuinely worse. Laudanum worked. Patients improved, or at least stopped suffering visibly, which in the 17th century was often the best available outcome. Sydenham couldn't have known about opioid receptor sites or the biochemistry of physical dependence. That knowledge was 2 centuries away. But Paracelsus had known something was wrong. He had written it down. And Sydenham, who was meticulous about almost everything, does not appear to have engaged seriously with that warning. By the time Sydenham died in 1689, laudanum was listed in the official pharmacopoeias of 3 European nations. It was being produced commercially, not just compounded by individual apothecaries. The price was falling, the distribution was widening, and a question was forming, quietly, in the bodies of the people taking it, long before anyone in medicine was asking it out loud. The question was simple. What happened to the people who tried to stop? Nobody in the medical establishment was looking for the answer yet. But in households across England, in the persistent sweats and cramps and sleepless nights of patients whose prescriptions had run out, the answer was already being written in the most reliable record of all, the human body's own response to what it had been given. The answer to what happened when people stopped arrived slowly, then all at once, carried not by physicians or reformers, but by the machinery of empire. By the early 1700s, Britain had built the most profitable drug supply chain in human history, and almost nobody called it that. The British East India Company had established control over the poppy-growing regions of Bengal and Bihar in northeastern India, where the soil and climate produced opium of exceptional quality and consistency. The company did not grow it for laudanum. It grew it primarily for the China trade, a commercial operation of staggering scale in which Indian opium was shipped east and exchanged for Chinese tea, silk, and silver. But the supply chain had a domestic endpoint. The surplus, the off-grade product, the volume that exceeded what could be shipped to Asia, all of it flowed back into British ports and from there into British apothecaries, patent medicine manufacturers, and chemists' shops. Laudanum, by 1750, was no longer a physician's preparation. It was an industrial commodity. The price reflected this. In London, by the mid-18th century, a standard bottle of laudanum cost less than a working man's daily wage. In the manufacturing towns of the north, where pharmacies competed for customers the way taverns did, it cost even less. The infrastructure of supply, the company's ships, the Bengal fields, the London warehouses, was so efficient and so vast that the domestic price of opium products fell steadily across the entire 18th century, even as the population grew and demand increased. Then came the wars. Between 1793 and 1815, Britain was almost continuously at war with France. The armies that fought at Talavera, Salamanca, and Waterloo carried laudanum in their medical kits the way modern armies carry field dressings. Regimental surgeons used it for amputations performed without anaesthesia, for the chest wounds that took days to kill a man, for the abdominal injuries that took longer. It was the only thing in the kit that reliably controlled pain at scale. Surgeons who ran out of it wrote urgent requisitions for resupply. Nobody questioned whether soldiers would become dependent. The question had not yet been framed in those terms. The immediate problem was suffering. Laudanum solved the immediate problem. Some of those soldiers came home. The veterans who returned from the Napoleonic Wars brought something back with them that didn't appear on any regimental manifest. The men who had been dosed regularly for wounds that healed found that their bodies had not forgotten the substance. Physicians in garrison towns began recording an unusual pattern. Former soldiers presenting not with pain, but with a restlessness and physical distress that resolved only when they obtained laudanum from a chemist. The doctors had no diagnostic category for what they were seeing. Most simply prescribed the laudanum and moved on. The war had field-tested opiate dependency on an industrial scale, and the men who came home were only one part of it. While the armies were fighting in Spain and Portugal, something else was happening on the shelves of every general store, apothecary, and travelling medicine vendor in Britain. Patent medicines, proprietary preparations sold under brand names with no requirement to disclose ingredients, had been expanding their market since the early 1700s. By the time the Napoleonic Wars ended, the industry had achieved something remarkable. It had made laudanum available to everyone who couldn't afford or access a physician, packaged not as opium but as cure. The names were specific, domestic, reassuring: Godfrey's cordial, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Dalby's carminative, Steedman's soothing powders, Battle's drops. Each was marketed for a slightly different complaint, but the active ingredient in nearly all of them was the same: significant quantities of laudanum, sometimes combined with alcohol, sometimes with sugar syrup to improve the taste. Godfrey's cordial, one of the most popular preparations in England, contained enough laudanum per standard dose to sedate an adult. It was marketed for infants, teething pain, colic, restlessness at night. The common childhood complaints that exhausted parents in every era have sought relief from. A mother working 14-hour shifts in a textile mill in Leeds, leaving her infant with a neighbour or an older child, could give the baby a dose of Godfrey's cordial before she left and the infant would sleep, would not cry, would not need feeding, would not demand the attention that the mother, on her wages and her schedule, could not provide. The baby would be quiet. The arrangement worked. Everyone found it practical. Coroners in manufacturing districts began noting a pattern in infant death sometime in the 1820s. Infants who died quietly, without apparent cause, without the dramatic presentation of a recognized disease. The bodies were small, the deaths were quick. In a world where infant mortality from genuine disease was so high that the death of a child under 2 was considered statistically ordinary, these deaths disappeared into the background noise of childhood mortality without generating systematic alarm. Nobody counted them. Nobody connected the cordial to the quiet deaths. The connection was sitting in plain view, but looking at it directly would have required confronting an industry worth millions of pounds and a practice that was keeping the workforce functioning. Quietly, a class divide was hardening inside Laudanum's story. In the drawing rooms of wealthy households, laudanum was still a physician's prescription, dispensed in measured doses, discussed in terms of therapeutic benefit, purchased from quality chemists who kept records. The wealthy woman who took laudanum for her nerves was a patient. In the back streets of Birmingham and Manchester, the woman who bought Godfrey's cordial for her baby at the corner shop was a customer. Same substance, different social frame. And then there was the second group that the patent medicine manufacturers had identified by the 1840s as an exceptionally reliable market. Women. Not specifically working class women, not specifically wealthy women. Women as a demographic category, across classes, targeted with a precision that the advertising of the era made no effort to conceal. Preparations for female complaints. Bottles whose labels listed symptoms that encompassed virtually every aspect of a woman's physical and emotional life. Irregular menstruation, painful periods, postpartum weakness, nervousness, low spirits, uterine irritability, excitability of the nervous system, inability to sleep. The language of the labels implied that women's bodies were in a state of constant instability requiring constant chemical management. The physicians who were prescribing laudanum to their private patients were using almost identical language. This was not coincidence. A pattern was becoming visible to anyone willing to look at the prescribing data without the assumptions of the era distorting the view. Women were being given laudanum not primarily for acute diagnosable physical conditions, not for the injuries and infections and post-surgical pain that justified its use in men, but for the experience of being a woman in a society that had structured their lives around legal powerlessness, social isolation, and emotional suppression. A woman who expressed persistent sadness was nervous. A woman who expressed anger was hysterical. A woman who expressed physical pain without an obvious organic cause was suffering from uterine disorder. All 3 diagnoses had the same treatment. In a household in Manchester in the winter of 1841, a woman whose name never made any record gave her infant a measured dose of Godfrey's cordial before the night shift began. She'd been doing this for 3 weeks. The baby slept reliably now. Slept through the night with a stillness she had initially found reassuring. She had mentioned to a neighbour that the cordial was remarkable, that she wished she had known about it sooner. The baby was 11 weeks old. She corked the bottle and set it back on the shelf above the fireplace, next to the tin of tea and the small Bible with the cracked spine. She pulled on her coat. She left for the mill before the first light came through the window. She did not yet know what the neighbour 3 doors down had begun to suspect, and what a Leeds coroner would document in 17 separate cases over the following decade, that the quiet the cordial produced was not always temporary. Nobody had told her what was in the bottle. Nobody was required to. Eleanor Marsh was 29 years old when she first held the bottle. It was small, no taller than her palm, dark amber glass so thick the liquid inside appeared almost black. The label read Batley's sedative solution, printed in the clean serif typeface that respectable pharmaceutical preparations use to signal their legitimacy. Her physician, a doctor. Aldous Pembridge of Edmund Street in Birmingham had written the prescription in November of 1872, 3 weeks after Eleanor had lost a pregnancy at 4 months. The prescription said 20 drops in water, twice daily, for nervous debility and sleeplessness. She measured the first dose over the kitchen basin, counting the drops carefully, the way the label instructed. Within 40 minutes, something happened that Eleanor had not experienced in months. The tightness across her chest, the one she had stopped noticing because it had become so constant, loosened. Not dramatically, not the way she might have imagined a medicine working, with some sudden and obvious change. It was quieter than that. The grief was still there, exactly where she had left it. But the sharp edge of it had softened. The way a word repeated too many times loses its meaning. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at the street below and felt, for the first time since October, that she might be able to remain in her own body without fighting it. She told Dr. Pembridge at her next appointment that the medicine was helping. He made a note in her file and renewed the prescription. What Eleanor was experiencing had a precise biochemical explanation that no physician in 1872 possessed. Laudanum's active compounds, principally morphine, along with codeine, thebaine, and roughly 40 other alkaloids, bind to specific receptor sites distributed throughout the human brain and nervous system. These receptors are part of the body's own pain management architecture, designed to respond to naturally occurring compounds the body produces in moments of extreme stress or physical trauma. When opiates from an external source flood those sites, the effect is not simply the suppression of pain signals. The entire emotional regulatory system is affected. Anxiety quiets. The relentless internal monologue that characterizes grief and depression slows. The physical sensations of distress, the chest tightness, the sleeplessness, the hypervigilance diminish. The body enters a state that feels from the inside like relief. The problem is what the body does next. Within days of regular opiate use, the receptor sites begin to adjust. The brain, responding to the external flood of compounds, reduces its own production of the naturally occurring equivalents. The threshold for what counts as enough rises. The dose that produced relief on day 1 produces something slightly less on day 14, and something less still on day 30. The body is not being weakened. It is adapting with perfect biological efficiency to a new chemical environment. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Eleanor did not know any of this. By January of 1873, 10 weeks after her first prescription, she was taking laudanum 4 times a day instead of 2. She had not made a conscious decision to increase the dose. The twice-daily amount had simply stopped being sufficient, and the insufficiency had expressed itself not as a craving, but as a return of the symptoms she was taking it to treat. The tightness, the sleeplessness, the grief that felt physical rather than emotional. The logical response was to take more medicine. That was what medicine was for. Dr. Pembridge, when she mentioned at her March appointment that she had adjusted the timing of her doses, did not express alarm. He noted that some patients required individualized dosing schedules and renewed her prescription with a slightly larger quantity. He was not negligent by the standards of his era. He was typical. In 1872, the medical understanding of laudanum dependency rested almost entirely on the question of whether the patient was taking the substance for legitimate medical reasons. A patient with a documented condition, nervous debility, uterine disorder, postpartum weakness, was receiving treatment. The concept that the treatment itself might generate a physiological state requiring continued treatment was present in the medical literature, but it was framed as a problem of character rather than chemistry. Physicians who wrote about opiate habituation in the 1870s consistently distinguished between the unfortunate class of persons of weak will who misused laudanum and genuine patients whose medical needs required its continued administration. Eleanor, with her physician's ongoing endorsement, belonged to the second category. The first category was a moral description. The second was a medical one. The body made no such distinction. Her days organised themselves around the bottle, not dramatically, not in the way that stories about substance dependency are usually told, with visible deterioration and obvious crisis. The reorganisation was subtle and almost entirely interior. Eleanor continued to manage the household. She corresponded with her sister in Coventry. She tended church on Sundays. Her husband, a solicitor named George Marsh, noticed only that she seemed calmer, less prone to the extended periods of weeping that had followed the miscarriage. He told her the medicine was clearly doing its job. She agreed. What he couldn't see was the mental arithmetic that had taken up permanent residence in the back of her mind. How much remained in the current bottle? Whether the chemist on New Street would be open on Saturday afternoon? The calculation, performed without conscious attention, of whether the dose she had taken an hour ago was enough to get her through the next 3 hours, or whether she would need another measure before dinner. George Marsh was a perceptive man in most respects. He noticed details about his legal cases that other solicitors missed. He read widely. He was considered a good listener by his colleagues. He did not notice any of this about his wife, because there was nothing visible to notice. Eleanor had not changed. Her life had not changed. Only the hidden architecture of her daily existence had restructured itself entirely around a small amber bottle. Victorian women's lives ran parallel to this restructuring with an almost mechanical compatibility. The social world Eleanor inhabited demanded precisely the qualities laudanum produced: calm, emotional containment, the management of distress without outward expression, the maintenance of domestic routine regardless of interior state. A woman who wept too readily was nervous. A woman who expressed anger was unwell. A woman who appeared tranquil, who moved through her days without visible disturbance, who managed her household and greeted her husband and sat through Sunday service without complaint. She was healthy. She was admirable. Laudanum produced this presentation reliably. The fact that it also produced beneath the surface a physiological dependency that was restructuring Eleanor's entire nervous system was invisible because the presentation it generated was exactly what the world around her wanted to see. In London, that same year of 1872, the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain was meeting to discuss whether laudanum sales should be more tightly controlled. The minutes of those meetings survive. The debate was careful, thorough, and extended across several sessions. Pharmacists raised concerns about over-the-counter sales. Several members cited the coroner's data from manufacturing districts. The discussion was substantive and the concerns were genuine. The debate was tabled. The commercial implications were too significant. Eleanor's bottle ran out on a Saturday in late April of 1873. The chemist on New Street closed at noon on Saturdays, and she'd miscalculated, had not noticed until Friday evening that she was nearly through the supply, had told herself it would be fine until Monday, had woken on Saturday morning and understood immediately before she was fully conscious that it would not be fine. By Saturday afternoon she was sweating through her dress despite the cool spring temperature. By evening the cramping in her legs had begun, a deep insistent ache that moved and wouldn't locate itself. She could not eat. She could not sleep. Her heart was doing something rapid and irregular that she had no name for. She sat in the bedroom with the curtains drawn and waited for Sunday to pass, telling George she had a headache, which was true but which was also the smallest part of what was happening. She did not connect what she was feeling to the absence of the medicine. The thought did not occur to her because the thought required a framework, the concept of physical dependency, the understanding that her body had been chemically altered by months of daily use, that simply did not exist in the vocabulary available to her. What she experienced on that Saturday and Sunday was mysterious and terrifying and completely without explanation. Monday morning, the chemist opened at 8. Eleanor was waiting at the door when he unlocked it. She bought 2 bottles instead of 1, and when she got home she took a dose immediately, standing in the hallway with her coat still on. Within the hour, the sweating stopped. The cramping faded. Her heart settled. She put the bottles in the cabinet above the washstand, behind the spare candles where George was unlikely to look, and went downstairs to start the day. She was not hiding them, exactly. She simply preferred not to have to explain something she herself could not explain. Dr. Pembridge retired from practice in the spring of 1876. His replacement was a younger man doctor. Frederick Callow recently arrived from London with up-to-date training and a full patient list. He reviewed Eleanor's file at their first appointment, noted the duration of her laudanum use, nearly 4 years, and the escalating quantity. He asked her, with clinical detachment, whether she had ever tried to reduce her dose. She told him twice. Both times, the sweating, the cramping, the heart, had driven her back before she reached the 3rd day. Dr. Callow listened carefully. He wrote in his notes that she displayed the characteristics of opiate habituation. Then he renewed her prescription. There was, in 1876, nothing else for him to do. Dr. Frederick Callow was not alone in noticing the pattern. He was simply alone in doing nothing extraordinary about it. Across Britain and the United States in the 1860s and 1870s, a scattered cohort of physicians was beginning to publish observations that, taken together, formed a picture so consistent it should have been impossible to dismiss. Dr. Charles Warrington, Earl of Chicago, compiled case notes from years of clinical practice and published his findings in 1880 with a specificity that the medical establishment found uncomfortable. The majority of his laudanum-dependent patients were women. They had not sought out the substance themselves. They had been handed it by physicians like him, for conditions that, reviewed honestly, amounted to variations on a single underlying circumstance: the experience of living a constrained life, with no sanctioned outlet for the distress that constraint produced. Earl did not use those words. The medical vocabulary of 1880 did not contain them. But the data in his case notes said them plainly enough. He was not the only one writing. Dr. H. H. Kane published a study of opiate habituation in 1881. Dr. John Hurt Cassidy documented the demographics of laudanum dependency in English provincial practices in 1883. Dr. Clifford Allbutt, one of the most respected clinicians in Britain, the man who would later edit the standard reference text of British medicine, wrote in 1870 that he had observed numerous cases in which laudanum had produced a bondage of the most terrible kind in patients who had been prescribed it in good faith by competent physicians. The evidence was not hidden. It was published, indexed, and available in every major medical library in the English-speaking world. The deaths were also being counted. Not thoroughly, not with the systematic rigour that a modern public health crisis would generate, but the numbers that did get recorded were staggering. In England and Wales between 1863 and 1890, the Registrar General's annual reports listed laudanum as the recorded cause of death in more than 16,000 cases. The coroners who compiled these figures were working with incomplete information, under-reporting from physicians who wrote natural causes to protect themselves and their patients' families from the stigma of a poison verdict, and a classification system that had no category for chronic opiate dependency as a cause of death. 16,000 was the floor, not the ceiling. Medical historians examining the same period have estimated the true figure was 3 to 4 times higher. 16,000 recorded deaths. The data sat in the Registrar General's reports, bound in green cloth, filed in government offices, read by exactly the people who had the authority to act on them. In 1868, Parliament had passed the Pharmacy Act, Britain's first serious attempt to regulate the sale of dangerous substances. The debate in the Commons had been substantive and the intention genuine. The Act required that certain poisons be sold only by registered pharmacists, that purchases be recorded in a poison register, and that bottles be clearly labelled with the word poison in prominent type. The list of substances covered was carefully constructed. It included arsenic, strychnine, prussic acid, and a range of other compounds whose lethality was well established. Laudanum was not on the list. The exclusion was not an oversight. The parliamentary record shows that during the drafting process, representatives of the patent medicine manufacturing industry had lobbied directly and effectively against laudanum's inclusion. Their argument was commercial, that requiring registration for laudanum sales would destroy the patent medicine trade, which employed thousands, generated significant tax revenue, and served a genuine public health need in communities without access to physicians. The argument worked. Laudanum was categorized not as a poison, but as a medicine, and medicines occupied a different regulatory category, one with no registration requirement, no labelling mandate, and no limit on who could purchase what quantity. The chemist who sold Clara Fenwick 3 bottles in 7 days was operating entirely within the law. That was not incidental. That was the outcome the industry had paid to produce. Eleanor Marsh knew nothing about the Pharmacy Act. She knew nothing about Earl's study or Allbutt's observations or the numbers in the Registrar General's reports. What she knew in 1876, when Dr. Callow renewed her prescription for the 4th consecutive year, was that the medicine kept her functional, and that stopping it made her ill in ways she had no framework to understand. Her daughter was 4 years old. Alice had been born in 1872, the same year Eleanor began taking laudanum, conceived before the miscarriage, carried to term while her mother's body was adjusting to its new chemical environment. She was a healthy child, unremarkable in the specific way that healthy children are unremarkable, noisy, curious, present. Eleanor loved her with a thoroughness that the laudanum did not diminish, but it changed the texture of that love, softened it, rounded its edges, placed a layer of gauze between feeling and expression that Alice, too young to name it, simply absorbed as the normal temperature of her mother's attention. In the spring of 1876, Alice found one of the amber bottles on the low shelf of the washstand while Eleanor was occupied downstairs. She turned it in her small hands, examining the label with the serious concentration of a child confronting an unfamiliar object. When Eleanor came upstairs and found her, she took the bottle gently, replaced it on the higher shelf, and told Alice it was for headaches. Alice accepted this. Children accept the explanations adults offer because they have no alternative. She filed the information away. In Parliament, meanwhile, the question of laudanum regulation had not died. It had simply been redirected. A select committee on patent medicines had been proposed but not yet convened. Individual MPs raised the issue in questions to the Home Secretary and received careful, non-committal responses about balancing public health concerns with the legitimate needs of the pharmaceutical industry. The language of those responses had been, in several cases, provided almost verbatim by industry representatives who had met privately with ministerial staff in the weeks before the questions were asked. Across the Atlantic, the American situation was, if anything, more clearly visible and more deliberately ignored. The United States patent medicine industry was generating an estimated $75 million annually by 1880, a figure that does not translate simply into modern money, but which, in the context of the American economy of that decade, represented one of the largest consumer product markets in the country. Manufacturers were required by federal law to pay a 2-cent tax on every bottle sold. The Internal Revenue Service collected this tax conscientiously and without asking what was in the bottles. The government knew the volume. It didn't ask about the contents. The contents, in product after product, were laudanum or morphine or both. Laudanum's position in American medicine had followed the same trajectory as in Britain, accelerated by the Civil War. Between 1861 and 1865, Union and Confederate medical services had distributed laudanum and injectable morphine. The hypodermic syringe had been developed in the 1850s, and field surgeons adopted it immediately, to an estimated 400,000 wounded soldiers. The men who came home brought their habits with them in numbers large enough that physicians began calling it soldier's disease, a term that acknowledged the scale while carefully locating responsibility in the individual veteran rather than in the military's prescribing practices. But soldier's disease, despite its name, was not primarily a soldier's problem by 1880. The majority of opiate-dependent individuals in post-Civil War America were women. The census data, the physician surveys, the pharmacy records, every source that attempted a demographic breakdown produced the same result. Women outnumbered men in laudanum dependency by ratios ranging from 2-to-1 to 3-to-1, depending on the region and the data source. The soldiers had been noticed and named. The women had been prescribed and forgotten. Then came the statistic that should have ended the debate entirely, and didn't. In the states where the temperance movement had achieved its greatest legislative successes, Ohio, Kansas, Maine, researchers examining pharmacy records in the late 1870s and early 1880s found something that only made sense once you understood the market logic behind it. In counties where alcohol sales had been prohibited or severely restricted, laudanum sales among women had doubled, not increased modestly, doubled. The substance that prohibition had targeted was alcohol, coded in the temperance movement's rhetoric as a male vice, a working-class vice, a moral failing concentrated in saloons and among men who couldn't govern their appetites. The movement's success in restricting alcohol created a vacuum in the market for chemical relief, and laudanum filled it with perfect efficiency, because laudanum was not coded as vice. It was medicine. It was what respectable women used. The temperance movement had been one of the few spaces in Victorian-era public life where women exercised genuine collective political power. Its leaders were formidable, organised, and effective. They had campaigned against alcohol with explicit reference to the damage it did to women and families, and their victory had driven those same women directly into the arms of an industry that was, by any pharmacological measure, selling them something more physiologically destructive than beer. Nobody in the temperance movement leadership publicly acknowledged this. The data was available. The connection was not complicated. But acknowledging it would have required confronting the category of medicine, with the same scrutiny being applied to the category of vice, and that confrontation did not happen in the 1880s. Eleanor Marsh, in Birmingham, was not a temperance campaigner. She was not a participant in any of these debates. She was a woman in her mid-30s who took her medicine in the morning, managed her household, watched her daughter grow from infant to child to young girl, and experienced the decade between 1876 and 1886 as a series of days that were neither happy nor unhappy in any way she could clearly articulate, only continuous, only manageable, only possible with the contents of the bottle she kept behind the spare candles on the washstand shelf. In 1884, Alice was 12 years old. She was observant in the specific way that children who grow up in quiet households become observant, alert to small deviations from routine, skilled at reading adult behaviour through the signals that adults don't know they're sending. She'd noticed that her mother took something from the washstand every morning before breakfast. She'd noticed the amber bottles cycling through the cabinet with a regularity that had no parallel in any other aspect of the household supplies. She'd noticed, without being able to name it, that her mother was more present on days when the supply was sufficient, and less present on days when Eleanor was waiting for a renewal. She was 12. She stored these observations the way children store things they don't yet have the language for, not as conclusions but as questions, unasked, waiting. What she could not know, what nobody in the household knew, was that the question she was silently accumulating had already been answered in 1880 by Dr. Charles Warrington, Earl of Chicago, in a paper that the medical establishment had read and not acted on. And what nobody anywhere knew yet, not Earl, not Eleanor's physicians, not the members of Parliament tabling their committees, not the manufacturers counting their revenues, was that in a laboratory in Frankfurt, Germany, a chemist was working on a problem that the entire industry had been waiting, whether it knew it or not, for someone to solve. The problem was simple to state. Laudanum was generating dependency at a scale that was becoming difficult to ignore, and the industry needed something it could market as safer. Something that could be presented to the physician, the patient and the regulator as the modern, responsible, scientific answer to the laudanum problem. The chemist's name was Heinrich Drieser. He was employed by a company called Bayer. He was close to a solution. The decades between 1870 and 1910 were not a single wave. They were a series of them, each larger than the last, each carrying a different population into the same current. The first wave had been respectable women in physicians' waiting rooms. The second had been working-class women at chemists' counters. The third was something more diffuse and harder to map. Laudanum moving through culture as atmosphere, as assumption, as the invisible medium through which certain kinds of lives were conducted. By the 1880s it had penetrated not just the medicine cabinet but the literary imagination, the social ritual, and the professional world in ways that made its presence feel less like an intrusion and more like furniture. Thomas de Quincey had started this process decades earlier. His Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published in 1821, had done something that no medical paper and no coroner's report had managed. It had made opium consumption interesting. De Quincey wrote about laudanum the way later writers would write about Paris, as a place of heightened sensation, of dreams architectural in their complexity, of a consciousness expanded beyond the limits of ordinary waking life. He also wrote about the horror of dependency, the physical torment of withdrawal, the way the substance had consumed years of his life. But the horror sections were read as the price of admission to the dreams, and the dreams were what readers remembered. Samuel Taylor Coleridge had been dependent on laudanum for decades before De Quincey published a word. John Keats used it. Wilkie Collins consumed quantities that alarmed his friends and apparently fueled his fiction. He reportedly mixed it into a silver goblet before settling to write, and called it his muse, though his hands trembled badly enough by his 50s that the handwriting in his manuscripts became difficult to decipher. Elizabeth Barrett Browning had been prescribed it in her 20s for a respiratory condition, and took it until her death at 55. The literary world did not treat these facts as cautionary. It treated them as biographical texture. The cultural narrative that resulted was specific and durable. Laudanum was associated with sensitivity, with a kind of nervous system refined enough to feel more than ordinary people felt and therefore requiring chemical management. This narrative protected the substance from the scrutiny applied to alcohol, which was crude, working class, male, visible in its damage. Laudanum was refined. Its damage was interior. Its users were artists and invalids and delicate women, not men brawling outside public houses. This distinction kept it outside the frame of moral reform that was reshaping Victorian attitudes toward intoxicants. In Birmingham, Eleanor Marsh was neither an artist nor a public figure. She was a solicitor's wife who'd been taking laudanum for 12 years by 1884, whose daily dose had stabilised at roughly 5 times her original prescription, and who had stopped attempting to reduce it after her second failed withdrawal. She did not think of herself as dependent. She thought of herself as someone with a chronic condition requiring ongoing treatment. The framing was her physician's. She had simply adopted it. Her daughter Alice, now 12, had begun asking questions that Eleanor answered with the smooth brevity of someone who had answered them many times in her own head before anyone else thought to ask them aloud. The household functioned. George Marsh's practice was prospering. The house on Hagley Road had been repainted the previous summer by every external measure visible to neighbours, tradespeople, and the families they socialised with. The Marsh household was orderly and comfortable, and entirely unremarkable. What Eleanor could not see, what nobody in Britain could yet see as a unified picture, was that her household was one point in a pattern that, drawn to its full scale, covered the entire industrialised world. In the United States, the pattern had achieved a density that was generating its own internal pressure. By 1890, estimates of laudanum and opiate-dependent individuals in America range from 250,000 at the conservative end to 400,000 at the high end, with the caveat that these figures were derived from pharmacy records and physician surveys that captured only a fraction of actual consumption. The majority of that population, in every survey, every regional study, every analysis of pharmacy data, were women. Specifically women between 25 and 55. Specifically women who had received their first dose from a physician. Specifically women who had been given a diagnosis that, translated out of the medical vocabulary of the era, meant, "She is unhappy, and we have given her something to manage it." The conditions listed in American medical records of the period read like a taxonomy of the female social experience rendered in clinical language. Neurasthenia, a diagnosis with no organic definition, applied to any woman showing symptoms of chronic stress or emotional exhaustion. Hysteria, applied to women who expressed emotion in ways their physicians found excessive. Uterine irritability, a catch-all for any gynecological complaint, real or imagined. Dysmenorrhea, postpartum melancholia, nervous prostration. The diagnostic labels changed depending on the physician and the decade, but the treatment was consistent. Laudanum, in doses calibrated to produce calm and renewed as long as the patient remained in the physician's care, which she generally did, because stopping was not something her body would permit without a crisis her physician would then treat with more laudanum. The circularity was not invisible. It was documented, observed, and published. What it was not was acted upon. Then came the data point that reframed everything the reform movement thought it understood about who was doing this to whom. Researchers examining pharmacy records in Ohio, Kansas, and Maine during the early 1880s had produced the temperance finding, the doubling of female laudanum consumption in counties where alcohol had been restricted. But the deeper implication of that data had not been fully drawn out until a statistician named Robert Greer, working for the Ohio State Board of Health in 1886, mapped the laudanum sales figures against the locations of temperance legislation and produced a single chart that made the relationship geometrically undeniable. Where the moral reform movement had succeeded most completely, the pharmaceutical dependency had grown most aggressively. The two curves moved in opposite directions and together formed a perfect scissors shape on the page. Greer's report was published in the Ohio Board of Health's annual document. It was not picked up by the national press. It was not cited in congressional testimony. It sat in the annual report, bound in the same institutional green cloth as the Registrar General's figures in London, read by the same category of official who had the authority to act and the incentive not to. Eleanor's world shifted in a way she didn't register in 1886. Her daughter was 14, old enough to be present at the edge of adult conversations, young enough to be excluded from their centre. Alice had developed a habit of sitting with a book in the corner of whatever room the adults occupied, not reading precisely, but appearing to read while absorbing everything said around her, with the quiet efficiency of a child who has learned that direct questions produce less information than patient observation. She'd been watching her mother for 2 years with the growing and unnameable unease of someone who can see the shape of something without having the word for it. George Marsh noticed nothing. He was a good man in most measurable respects, generous with his time, reliable in his obligations, genuinely fond of his family. But he operated on a principle common to men of his class and era. The domestic interior of the household was Eleanor's domain, and Eleanor was managing it. The evidence he had was the evidence the household presented to him. The house was clean, dinner was served, his wife was calm, his daughter was healthy. He did not know what calm was costing. In London, the literary world's relationship with laudanum was entering its most self-aware phase, which paradoxically made it less rather than more alarming to the public. The publication of Sherlock Holmes stories beginning in 1887 had introduced a readership to the figure of the brilliant mind requiring chemical assistance, without notably making the chemical assistance itself seem dangerous. Holmes used cocaine, not laudanum, but the cultural logic was the same. Extraordinary minds required extraordinary chemistry. The romanticisation of opiate use had not faded with De Quincey's generation. It had simply found new vehicles. Meanwhile, in the manufacturing districts, laudanum was doing something neither the literary romanticists nor the medical establishment had fully accounted for. It was transmitting itself generationally. The mechanism was not genetic, not in any sense that 19th century science could have identified. It was behavioural and environmental. Children who grew up in households where laudanum was a daily presence absorbed certain information, that chemical relief from distress was normal, available and legitimate, that the amber bottle on the shelf was part of managing life, not escaping it, that the word medicine covered a range of needs that extended well beyond the physical. These children grew up, encountered their own distress, and reached for the nearest available tool with the confidence of people acting on established precedent. Alice Marsh was 14 in 1886 when she filed away one more observation. Her mother had run out of laudanum on a Thursday and had sent Alice herself to the chemist on New Street with a note and the correct coins. The chemist had handed over the bottle without hesitation, noting only that Mrs. Marsh's prescription would need renewing by month's end. Alice had carried it home in her coat pocket, feeling the small weight of it against her hip the whole walk back. She handed it to her mother without a word. Eleanor took it with both hands and didn't look at her daughter's face. And in Frankfurt, at the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company's research laboratories, Heinrich Drieser had by the mid-1890s completed the work he'd been developing for years. He had taken morphine, laudanum's primary active compound, and altered it chemically through a process called acetylation, adding 2 acetyl groups to the morphine molecule. The resulting compound was diacetyl morphine. It was 2 to 3 times more potent than morphine. It crossed the blood-brain barrier faster. It produced a more rapid and intense effect. Drieser tested it on animals, then on Bayer workers who volunteered. The volunteers reported that the new compound made them feel heroic, heroisch in German. The name wrote itself. Bayer's marketing department began preparing materials describing heroin as a non-addictive substitute for morphine and laudanum. The preparations cited Drieser's own research, which had been conducted over a period of months rather than years, on a sample size that would not have satisfied any modern clinical standard, and which had not included a single long-term follow-up study. The brochures were clean, modern, and professionally typeset. They were mailed to physicians across Europe and North America. They described heroin as safe for women, safe for children, and specifically indicated for patients who had developed a dependence on laudanum or morphine and needed a transition compound. A transition compound, that was the phrase. Eleanor Marsh, in 1895, had been taking laudanum for 23 years. Alice was 23 years old and had recently married a man named Thomas Hargreaves, a clerk in a shipping company, and moved with him to a house in Clapham, South London. She had written to her mother twice since the wedding. Eleanor had written back once, a letter of 2 paragraphs in handwriting that wavered at the end of each line. In Clapham, Alice had visited a physician named Dr. Bernard Lisle for what she described as persistent fatigue and low spirits following a difficult first year of marriage. Dr. Lisle had a brochure from Bayer on his desk. He had received it 3 weeks earlier along with a sample package and a covering letter, describing the new preparation's remarkable efficacy and its distinguished advantage over older opiate preparations. He told Alice about it. She asked what it was made from. He told her it was a modern pharmaceutical compound, scientifically refined. She took the small paper packet home and placed it on the shelf in the kitchen, next to the tea. It sat there for 2 weeks before she opened it. She was not desperate. She was not in crisis. She was simply tired and sad, and had grown up in a household where the response to tiredness and sadness involved a bottle on a shelf. She mixed the powder with water and drank it on a Tuesday morning while Thomas was at work. By midday she understood, without having any way to know why she understood, that she would be doing this again. The story everyone had been told for 80 years went like this. Laudanum was medicine, dependency was weakness, and the women who couldn't stop were constitutionally fragile individuals whose personal failings had turned a legitimate treatment into a personal catastrophe. That story was constructed, carefully, profitably, and with the active participation of institutions that had the data to know better. The construction became visible only when historians in the late 20th century began doing something that nobody had systematically done at the time, reading the medical records of laudanum-dependent women not as individual case studies, but as a population, and asking what those women actually presented with when they first walked into a physician's office. The findings were not ambiguous. The majority of women in Victorian-era medical records who were subsequently prescribed laudanum had presented initially with symptoms that modern clinical frameworks recognise as treatable anxiety disorders, grief responses, postpartum depression, or chronic pain conditions. Not all of these had effective treatments available in 1870, but some did. Rest, improved nutrition, social support, and removal from sources of acute stress produced documented improvements in patients with anxiety and grief responses across multiple clinical observations of the period. These interventions were slower than laudanum. They required more physician time. They produced less immediate and visible results, and they generated no revenue for the pharmaceutical supply chain. Laudanum was not the only tool. It was the fastest, cheapest, and most commercially convenient tool. That distinction between what was available and what was prescribed is the centre of the entire story. The pharmaceutical infrastructure surrounding that choice was not hidden. It was simply not examined with the directness that examination would have required. By 1890, the 5 largest laudanum and opiate preparation manufacturers in Britain, among them Savory and Moore, Allen and Hanbury's, and the expanding operations of Burroughs Wellcome, were also among the primary financial supporters of British medical education. Endowments, lecture series, laboratory equipment, the funding of hospital wings whose names were carved in stone above the entrances. The relationship between commercial pharmaceutical interest and clinical medical practice was not a secret. It was celebrated as evidence of industry's commitment to scientific progress. The same manufacturers were the primary advertisers in the major British medical journals. The Lancet and the British Medical Journal carried laudanum and opiate preparation advertisements throughout the 1870s and 1880s, not concealed in the back pages, but prominently placed alongside peer-reviewed clinical articles. A physician reading a paper on the treatment of nervous complaints in women would turn the page to find a full advertisement for a laudanum preparation, complete with dosing recommendations and testimonials from named colleagues. The physicians who wrote those clinical articles and the companies that placed those advertisements operated in the same professional world, attended the same conferences, and in many cases knew each other personally. None of this required conspiracy. It required only the ordinary social friction of a professional community in which certain conclusions were more comfortable than others and certain questions were less likely to be asked. Into this system, in 1898, Bayer launched heroin. The launch was not tentative. It was one of the most aggressively managed pharmaceutical introductions of the 19th century. A coordinated campaign of medical journal advertising, physician outreach, sample distribution, and conference presentations that positioned diacetyl morphine as the scientific answer to the opiate dependency problem that the medical establishment had spent 30 years declining to confront directly. The central marketing claim was specific and unambiguous. Heroin was non-addictive. The supporting evidence was Drieser's internal research, studies of insufficient duration, inadequate sample size, and no long-term follow-up, which Bayer presented to physicians as settled clinical science. The claim appeared in advertisements, in the covering letters accompanying sample packages, in the conference presentations Drieser and his colleagues delivered to medical audiences across Europe and North America. It appeared so consistently and with such institutional confidence that physicians who had no reason to doubt Bayer's research absorbed it as established fact. Non-addictive. The word did specific work in the medical marketplace of 1898. Physicians had been watching laudanum dependency accumulate in their patient populations for decades. They had been writing about it, worrying about it privately, and largely failing to act on it publicly, partly because of institutional pressure, partly because there was nothing effective to replace laudanum with, and partly because the diagnostic framework available to them still placed responsibility for dependency in the patient's character rather than the substance's pharmacology. Heroin offered them an exit from this uncomfortable position, a modern compound, scientifically refined, non-addictive, the solution that the best available science had produced. The compound was distributed to physicians for precisely the patients who needed it most, those already dependent on laudanum or morphine, who had tried to stop and failed, whose physicians had documented the dependency in case notes that represented years of quiet professional discomfort. Heroin was presented as the transition compound that would allow these patients to step down from their dependency safely. What Drieser's short-term studies had not captured, what the months-long research program had structurally prevented anyone from discovering before the launch, was that diacetyl morphine was not less addictive than morphine. It was significantly more so. Its faster onset and greater potency meant the body adapted to it more rapidly and more completely than it had adapted to laudanum. The dependency it created was deeper. The withdrawal it produced when stopped was more severe. The dose required to maintain stability escalated faster. None of this was knowable from Drieser's data at the time of the 1898 launch. It became knowable in the years immediately following, as the patients who had been switched from laudanum to heroin began presenting to their physicians not with resolved dependency, but with dependency of a character, an intensity that made their laudanum habits look, by comparison, manageable. The physicians who saw this, and within 3 to 4 years many were seeing it, were in an extraordinarily difficult position. They had prescribed heroin in good faith based on Bayer's representations. Their patients were now more severely dependent than before. The professional and legal exposure this created was not small. The response, in many cases, was the same response that had characterized the Laudanum situation for decades. Continued prescription, reframed as ongoing medical management, the dependency documented in case notes with the careful neutrality of language that describes without concluding. Alice Hargreaves, in Clapham, had been taking heroin for 3 years by 1898. Dr. Leal had formalised the prescription after her second visit, at which she had described the fatigue and low spirits as persistent, and had mentioned, carefully, that the preparation he had given her previously had been helpful. He prescribed it at a standard dose. He renewed it quarterly. He noted in her file that she was responding well to treatment. She was 26 years old. She had no children. Thomas Hargreaves worked long hours and was not, by the account of the household's behaviour, paying close attention to what was happening on his wife's side of their shared life. The heroin occupied the same shelf position the laudanum had occupied in her mother's kitchen, next to ordinary things processed as ordinary, its presence normalised by the simple fact of its prescription. But something in Alice's situation differed from her mother's in a way that would take years to fully surface. Eleanor had been sedated by laudanum into a kind of stable, muted functionality, present, managed, contained. The heroin Alice was taking produced, particularly in its early months, something closer to the state De Quincey had described, a brightening of sensation, a lifting of the flatness that had characterized her first year of marriage, a feeling of competence and energy that had initially seemed like the medicine working as intended. The lift was temporary, the body adjusted, as it always adjusted. But the memory of that early brightness remained, and it was the memory, the gap between how she had felt in those first months and how she felt now, that drove the escalation more powerfully than any physical compulsion. In Birmingham, Eleanor Marsh had turned 52 in 1895. Her laudanum use had stabilised into a daily routine so deeply embedded in her physiology that it had become, in the most literal sense, part of how her nervous system functioned. She was not visibly impaired. She was not the figure of Victorian melodrama, the hollow-eyed wraith, the trembling invalid. She was a middle-aged woman of moderate means who moved through her days with the careful economy of someone who has learned exactly how much energy is available and does not exceed it. George Marsh had retired from his practice. He was home more. He noticed, with the heightened attention of a man who suddenly had time to observe what he had previously been too busy to see, that Eleanor took something from the cabinet every morning without fail, that she was unsettled on the rare occasions the chemist's order was delayed, that the household's pharmaceutical expenditure was, on review, considerably higher than he had previously registered. He asked her physician about it. Dr. Callow, who had been renewing Eleanor's prescription for 20 years, told him that Eleanor had a chronic condition requiring ongoing management, and that the treatment was appropriate and well established. George Marsh accepted this. There was no other framework available to him, and the man who had supplied Eleanor's prescriptions for 2 decades had told him, with professional authority, that everything was in order. What Callow did not tell him, what Callow may not have fully articulated even to himself, was that he had been renewing this prescription out of the same institutional inertia that had shaped the entire history of laudanum's medical use. Not because he had evaluated Eleanor's current condition and determined that laudanum was still clinically indicated, but because stopping the prescription would produce a withdrawal crisis that he had no tools to manage, and because the prescription represented a stable outcome in a patient he had known for 2 decades, and because the alternative to prescription was a confrontation with consequences that the medical establishment had spent 30 years constructing an elaborate professional architecture to avoid. The same architecture was now being applied to heroin. In 1900, the American Journal of Pharmacy published a paper noting that several physicians had observed heroin dependency in patients who had been switched from morphine as part of the Bayer protocol. The paper was careful, measured, and appropriately hedged with the qualifications of early clinical observation. It did not call for a moratorium on heroin prescription. It called for further study. Bayer's response was to increase its advertising spend in American medical journals. The following year, a Boston physician named Dr. George Petty published a more direct account of 12 patients who had developed what he explicitly called heroin addiction after receiving the compound as a laudanum substitute. Petty was not a peripheral figure. He had published extensively on opiate dependency and was known in the field. His paper was read. It generated discussion. It was not acted upon by any regulatory body in the United States or Britain. Alice Hargreaves, reading none of this, was in 1901 obtaining her heroin from two separate physicians, Dr. Lizzle in Clapham and a second doctor in Brixton whose name she had obtained from a neighbour. Because the quarterly prescription from a single source had become insufficient. She had not told Thomas about the second physician. She managed the household accounts herself and had found, through careful adjustment of the grocery and household figures, a way to absorb the additional cost without the discrepancy becoming visible. She was 29 years old. She was intelligent, organised, and precise under conditions of significant internal pressure. These were not incidental qualities. They were the skills her situation demanded, and she had developed them. In Birmingham, her mother was measuring out drops on a Tuesday morning in November, standing at the washstand with the practiced efficiency of someone performing a task so routine it required no conscious attention. The light through the bedroom window was flat and grey. George was already downstairs. The house was quiet. Eleanor corked the bottle and replaced it behind the candles and went to the window and stood for a moment looking at the street below. The same street she'd looked at from this window for 30 years. The same terraced houses, the same iron railings, the pavement darker near the drain. She was 52 years old, and she'd been taking laudanum since she was 29. Her daughter was in London taking something she'd been told was safer. Neither of them knew what the other's mornings looked like. Neither of them had a word for what the mornings were. By 1900, the scale had become impossible to manage with silence alone. Something else was needed. What arrived was not reform. It was relabeling. The first decade of the 20th century produced, on both sides of the Atlantic, a legislative response to the opiate crisis that accomplished something the industry could not have designed more effectively if it had tried. It shifted the weight of consequence from the manufacturer to the user, from the institution to the individual, and from the substance to the person consuming it. The mechanism was not cynical in its origins. Most of the politicians and reformers who drove narcotics legislation in Britain and the United States were genuinely alarmed by what they were seeing and genuinely motivated by the desire to address it. But they were working within a framework of assumptions about addiction that had been constructed over decades by the same professional and commercial infrastructure that had created the crisis, and those assumptions shaped what the legislation targeted and what it left untouched. The central assumption was this: that dependency was primarily a failure of individual character rather than a predictable physiological response to a chemically dependency-forming substance. This assumption had been present in medical literature since the first serious discussions of laudanum habituation in the 1860s. It had been reinforced by the class and gender dynamics of who was being observed: working-class patients, women, veterans, populations whose dependency could be attributed to pre-existing weakness rather than to the properties of what they had been given. By 1900, this assumption was so thoroughly embedded in the institutional thinking of medicine, law, and social policy that it functioned not as a conclusion, but as a premise. Legislation built on that premise targeted users. In the United States, the movement toward federal narcotics control had been accelerating since the late 1890s, driven by a confluence of factors that had almost nothing to do with the women in physicians' offices taking laudanum for nervous complaints. The primary political energy behind federal action came from two sources: the anti-opium smoking campaign, which was explicitly and unapologetically framed around racial anxieties about Chinese immigrants and opium dens, and the international pressure generated by America's newly acquired colonial presence in the Philippines, where the opium trade was a significant governance problem. Hamilton Wright, the State Department official who became the primary architect of federal narcotics policy, had spent years in Asia and framed the domestic opiate problem almost entirely through the lens of racial contamination and foreign vice. The millions of white middle-class women who'd been taking physician-prescribed laudanum for decades barely appeared in Wright's public testimony. They were not the image he was constructing. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 was passed with significant public support and presented as a straightforward revenue and regulation measure, a tax on opiate and cocaine transactions, requiring registration by manufacturers, distributors, and dispensing physicians. Its practical effect, through a series of Treasury Department rulings and court decisions in the years immediately following its passage, was to make it illegal for physicians to prescribe opiates to maintain a patient's existing dependency. The logic was that maintenance prescribing was not a legitimate medical purpose. Dependency was not a disease requiring treatment. It was a habit requiring cessation. The women who had been receiving laudanum prescriptions from their physicians for 10, 15, 20 years found themselves almost overnight cut off. Eleanor Marsh in Birmingham was 65 years old in 1908, the year she died. The death certificate listed cardiac failure. Dr. Callow, who had been her physician for 32 years, did not record laudanum dependency as a contributing factor. He had renewed her prescription 3 weeks before her death. The bottle on the washstand was 2/3 full when George found it. He did not know what to do with it, and eventually asked the chemist to dispose of it. George Marsh, sorting through Eleanor's papers in the weeks after the funeral, found the receipts. 36 years of pharmaceutical purchases recorded in the household accounts with Eleanor's careful handwriting. The column of figures stretched across page after page of the account book. He added them up once and did not add them up again. He wrote to Alice in London. The letter described Eleanor's final weeks, the funeral arrangements, the disposition of the household contents. It said nothing about the account book. George was not a man who expressed certain kinds of knowledge directly. He had spent 36 years not asking the question the account book answered. He was not going to ask it now, in a letter, with Eleanor 3 weeks in the ground. Alice Hargreaves received the letter on a Wednesday morning in November 1908. She read it at the kitchen table in Clapham, sitting very still, her hands flat on the table on either side of the single sheet of paper. She was 36 years old. She had been taking heroin for 13 years. She did not cry. She sat at the table for a long time after finishing the letter, looking at the wall above the fireplace where a small watercolour of the Worcestershire countryside had hung since their wedding. Then she folded the letter and put it in the drawer with the household papers. She did not connect her mother's death to the amber bottles on the Birmingham washstand. The framework for making that connection, the understanding of what chronic opiate consumption did to a cardiovascular system over decades, was not available to her. What she had was grief, and grief was something she had a method for managing. She measured out her dose and went about the day. In London's Parliament, the Select Committee on Patent Medicines had finally been convened in 1912 after years of procedural delay. The committee had done what earlier investigations had failed to do. It had systematically tested the contents of popular patent preparations, published the results, and documented the gap between what the labels claimed and what the bottles contained. The resulting report ran to more than 600 pages. It was detailed, methodical, and damning. It described an industry that had operated for more than a century on the basis of deliberate consumer deception, generating dependency in millions of people who had been told they were receiving harmless herbal preparations. The report recommended comprehensive regulation, mandatory ingredient disclosure, prohibition of false therapeutic claims, restriction of opiate content in over-the-counter preparations. The committee's evidence was unimpeachable. Its conclusions were supported by data that the industry could not effectively contest. The government received the report and tabled it. The First World War intervened 8 months later, and the legislative agenda that might have addressed the patent medicine industry's practices was set aside for 4 years of more immediately consuming emergencies. When the Dangerous Drugs Act finally passed in 1920, it was shaped by the same logic as the Harrison Act in the United States. Criminalize possession and maintenance prescribing. Treat dependency as a social and moral problem. Construct a regulatory framework that controlled the user rather than the supply chain. The women who had built their daily functioning around physician prescriptions for 3 or 4 decades found themselves reclassified. The medical language shifted beneath them with a speed that was almost audible. Women who had been described in case notes for decades as delicate patients requiring chemical support appeared in the new post-1914 medical literature as habitual users, a term that placed the emphasis entirely on the individual's behaviour pattern rather than on the physiological state the substance had created. The same woman, the same dependency, a completely different set of words, carrying a completely different assignment of responsibility. Several suffragette leaders, among them figures who had been organising politically since the 1880s, had seen this mechanism operating for years and had written about it with a clarity that the medical establishment found easy to dismiss. Christabel Pankhurst and other writers in the suffragette press had argued explicitly that laudanum's mass prescription to women was not incidental to their political situation, but structural to it, that a population chemically managed into calm compliance was a population less capable of organised resistance, and that the framing of women's distress as medical rather than political was a tool for containing both. Their arguments were published in movement newspapers and pamphlets with circulations in the tens of thousands. The medical establishment's response was to cite their arguments as evidence of the hysterical tendencies that made women unsuitable for political participation. The circularity was perfect, and it was deliberate, even if no single person had designed it. Alice Hargreaves, by 1914, was navigating the new legal landscape with the same organisational efficiency she had applied to her 2-physician arrangement. The Harrison Act applied to the United States. The British equivalent was still 6 years away. But the climate had shifted. Physicians were becoming more cautious, chemists more likely to ask questions, the social atmosphere around opiate use hardening from medical tolerance to something with more edges. Dr. Leal had retired. His replacement had reviewed Alice's file at their first appointment with an expression she had learned to read quickly, and had told her, with what he clearly intended as kindness, that he would be prescribing a gradually reducing dose with the goal of cessation within 6 months. She had nodded, thanked him, and made an appointment with the Brixton physician the following week. Thomas Hargreaves had by now a working knowledge of his wife's situation, assembled over years from small observations he had never organised into a direct confrontation. He knew there was a second physician. He knew the household accounts had areas he was not meant to examine closely. He was not a passive man by nature, but the tools the era offered him for addressing what he understood were inadequate to the complexity of what he was actually facing, and he had settled into a position of managed not knowing that felt, on the surface, very much like the position George Marsh had occupied in Birmingham for 36 years. The peak of the crisis, when it finally became undeniable, was not marked by a single event. It was a convergence of numbers too large to explain away, of bodies in coroners' offices, of veterans returning from the trenches of France who had been dosed with morphine for wounds and gas injuries, and who were flooding the already strained post-war medical system with dependency claims that the new legal framework had made almost impossible to treat. 20,000 deaths attributable to opiates in the United States between 1895 and 1915. Estimates from the British Medical Journal in 1916 suggesting that opiate-dependent individuals in England outnumbered the British casualties at the Somme. The Somme killed 60,000 men in a single day. At the post-war inquiry into pharmaceutical regulation, a physician named Dr. William Wilcox testified before the committee with a specific calculation he had derived from pharmacy records, mortality data, and the census figures for the relevant decades. His estimate was that between 1860 and 1920, somewhere between 2 and 4 million women in Britain and the United States had developed opiate dependency through medical prescription. He presented this figure with the careful qualification that it was an estimate rather than a count, that the true figure was uncountable because the majority of those women had never been identified, never been recorded as dependent, had simply lived their constrained chemical lives and died with causes listed as cardiac failure or natural causes or simply old age, their dependencies buried with them in the absence of any medical or legal framework that had ever looked at them directly and called what it saw by its name, 2 to 4 million. The committee received this testimony and moved on to the next witness. Alice, in 1914, the year the Harrison Act passed in America and the year the first British narcotics restrictions began taking shape in parliamentary discussion, had made 2 attempts to stop. The first had lasted 4 days. The second had lasted 6. On the 7th day of the second attempt, the symptoms, the sweating, the muscle cramping, the insomnia so complete it felt physiologically impossible, the sensation that her skin was simultaneously burning and freezing, had driven her to the Brixton physician's surgery at 7 in the morning, before the official opening time, knocking until someone answered. She was 42 years old. She had been dependent on opiates in some form for 19 years. The law had changed. The system that had created her situation had updated its language and transferred responsibility to her. The substance remained identical. Her body's relationship to it remained identical. The only thing that had changed was that the institutions which had spent decades prescribing it, regulating it inadequately, ignoring the evidence of its effects, and profiting from its distribution, had now successfully repositioned themselves as the solution to a crisis of individual moral weakness. The last clear trace of Alice Hargreaves in the historical record is a letter written to Thomas in 1922, found in a solicitor's files during a property dispute resolved in 1931. She's living in a boarding house in Islington. She's 50 years old. The letter concerns a financial matter, the disposal of a small sum left by George Marsh's estate. The handwriting is careful and the sentences are grammatically precise. She signs it with her full name. There is nothing in the letter about her health. There is nothing about laudanum or heroin, or the 27 years that had passed since Dr. Lyle placed a Bayer sample packet on his desk in Clapham, and described its contents as a modern pharmaceutical compound, scientifically refined, non-addictive. The letter is 2 paragraphs long. The second paragraph asks Thomas to handle the legal correspondence directly, as she finds it difficult to travel across the city at present. She's not in any history book. She left no famous work, no political legacy, no medical record that any researcher has located. She was one of millions who moved through the machinery of what happened and left only the faint paper trail of ordinary life, a prescription renewed, an account book entry, a letter about an inheritance, a signature at the bottom of a page. The boarding house in Islington was on a street where the gas lamp on the corner had needed a new mantle for 3 weeks, and nobody had come to fix it. Alice had stopped noticing it. She had stopped noticing a great many things that she had once paid close attention to. The window of her room faced north and received no direct sunlight at any hour of the day. What happened to her after 1922 is not recorded. Laudanum did not disappear after 1920. It was reclassified, restricted, gradually replaced in the pharmacopoeia by substances that arrived with better marketing and shorter histories too short, each time to show what the longer view would eventually reveal. The pattern of succession was so consistent it had the quality of repetition rather than accident. Morphine had been isolated from opium in 1804 and promoted as a safer alternative to raw laudanum preparations, more precise in dosing, more controllable, more scientific. Heroin had been synthesized from morphine in 1898 and promoted as non-addictive. In 1903, barbituric acid derivatives, barbiturates, were introduced and promoted as a safe sedative alternative to opiates, specifically indicated for the nervous complaints and sleeplessness that laudanum had been treating for a century. In the 1950s, meprobaamate arrived under the brand name Milltown, marketed as a tranquilizer for anxiety that lacked the dependency risks of earlier compounds. In 1960, chlordiazepoxide, the first benzodiazepine, was introduced under the name Librium, followed 3 years later by diazepam, sold as Valium. Each compound was newer than the last. Each was described at launch with language that emphasized its improved safety profile relative to its predecessor. Each was prescribed disproportionately to women for conditions that mapped almost perfectly onto the diagnostic categories that had generated laudanum prescriptions a century earlier: anxiety, nervousness, sleeplessness, emotional distress without identified organic cause. Valium, by 1978, was the most prescribed drug in the Western world. The Rolling Stones had written a song about it in 1966, Mother's Little Helper, describing a suburban housewife's daily dependence on a little yellow pill that helped her get through her busy dying day. The song was not subtle. It was also not sufficient. The prescription rates continued rising for another decade after its release. The biochemical mechanisms were different for each compound in the succession. The social mechanism was identical. A population of women experiencing distress generated by structural conditions, isolation, legal and economic powerlessness, the cultural demand for emotional suppression, untreated physical and mental health conditions, encountered a medical system that had a faster and cheaper intervention available than addressing those conditions directly. The faster intervention was chemical. It worked in the short term. The short term extended into years. The years accumulated into dependency. The dependency was then addressed with the next available compound, described as safer. The American Medical Association formally acknowledged in 1932 that opiate dependency was a medical condition rather than a moral failing. This acknowledgement came 70 years after the first clear clinical evidence, 40 years after Earle's published observations, 18 years after the Harrison Act had criminalized the treatment of the condition the AMA was now recognizing as a disease. The timing was not coincidental. The Harrison Act had created a legal framework that made maintenance prescribing criminal, which had in turn created a population of dependent individuals obtaining opiates through illegal channels, which had generated the criminal justice data that made the scale of the problem impossible to continue attributing primarily to personal weakness. The AMA's acknowledgement changed the language. It did not change the prescribing architecture. In the decades following the Second World War, the pharmaceutical industry underwent a transformation in scale and organisation that made the Victorian-era patent medicine manufacturers look artisanal by comparison. Mergers, public listings, multinational distribution networks, research and development budgets measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. The infrastructure expanded to match the markets it was serving. The relationship between the industry and the medical profession was formalized through new channels: research funding, clinical trial sponsorship, the systematic cultivation of key opinion leaders whose published work shaped prescribing guidelines, the funding of medical education through industry-sponsored conferences and continuing education programs. The structural relationship that had existed between Allen and Hanbury's and the Victorian medical press, advertising alongside peer-reviewed articles, commercial interest embedded in clinical guidance, had not been reformed. It had been professionalized, and the specific vulnerability that Laudanum had exploited, the gap between what medicine could do for women's pain and distress and what it was willing to do, and the filling of that gap with dependency-forming compounds presented as treatments, persisted through every decade of the 20th century, with a consistency that the succession of brand names and molecular structures obscured but did not alter. The OxyContin launch in 1996 was, in this context, not an anomaly. It was the most recent iteration of a commercial and clinical logic that had been operating continuously since Thomas Sydenham reformulated laudanum in 1660 and began prescribing it for everything. Purdue Pharma's marketing of OxyContin deployed specific claims about the drug's extended-release formulation that echoed, with eerie precision, the language Bayer had used for heroin 98 years earlier. The controlled release mechanism, Purdue's representatives told physicians, meant that OxyContin was less likely to produce dependency than immediate-release opioids. The claim appeared in sales materials, in presentations to physicians, in the training given to the 500 sales representatives Purdue deployed across the United States in the first years after launch. It was based on internal research of insufficient duration and scope. It was wrong in exactly the way Bayer's claim about heroin had been wrong, for exactly the same pharmacological reasons. By 2000, OxyContin was generating $1 billion annually in revenue. By 2010, prescription opioid overdose deaths in the United States exceeded 45,000 per year. The majority of initial prescriptions in the epidemic's first phase had been written for pain conditions, injuries, post-surgical recovery, chronic pain, but the demographic data showed a familiar pattern developing beneath the headline numbers. Women were being prescribed opioid painkillers for chronic pain conditions at higher rates than men presenting with equivalent reported pain levels. They were also, studies showed, less likely to have their pain taken seriously in emergency settings, more likely to wait longer for pain assessment, and more likely to be told their pain had a psychological rather than physical origin. The mechanism was different. The pattern was not. In 2017, the United States Department of Health declared the opioid epidemic a public health emergency. Congressional hearings were convened. Purdue Pharma executives testified. Documents emerged in litigation showing that internal communications had flagged dependency concerns years before they appeared in public data, and that the company had continued its marketing activities regardless. The legal proceedings extended across multiple years and multiple jurisdictions. In 2020, Purdue filed for bankruptcy as part of a settlement that provided billions of dollars in compensation to affected states and individuals. The Sackler family, who had owned Purdue, retained most of their personal wealth. The settlement had a provision requiring Purdue to release internal documents into the public record. Among those documents were marketing analyses, sales training materials, and internal memoranda discussing the company's awareness of dependency rates in patient populations. The documents were released in tranches over several years. Researchers and journalists worked through them methodically, publishing findings that accumulated into a picture of institutional decision-making that bore a structural resemblance to the pharmaceutical manufacturers of the 1880s. Not because history was literally repeating, but because the commercial and regulatory framework within which both had operated had never been fundamentally restructured. The 1910 Select Committee on Patent Medicines had recommended comprehensive reform. It had been tabled. The 1914 Harrison Act had targeted users rather than manufacturers. The 1920 Dangerous Drugs Act had done the same. Every major regulatory response to every phase of the opiate crisis across 150 years had left the underlying commercial architecture intact while constructing increasingly elaborate criminal justice and public health frameworks around the individuals it had created. The historians who had worked through the Victorian medical records in the 1980s and 1990s, the researchers whose findings had revealed that the majority of laudanum-dependent women had originally presented with treatable conditions, published their work in academic journals with circulations of a few thousand specialists. Their conclusions did not generate the kind of public reckoning that might have been generated if the same findings had been available in 1900, when the framework for response was still being constructed. By the time the scholarship was complete, the framework had been in place for 80 years, its assumptions calcified into law, medical education, and cultural common sense. What changed in the century between laudanum's peak and the OxyContin hearings was the sophistication of the instruments. What did not change was the question that the instruments kept raising and the institutions kept declining to answer directly. When a substance creates dependency in the people it is prescribed to, and that dependency was foreseeable from the evidence available at the time of prescribing, and the evidence was suppressed or ignored or inadequately acted upon by the institutions with the authority to act. What is the name for that? The law had one answer. Medicine had another. The pharmaceutical industry's legal departments had a third. The women in Eleanor Marsh's position never got to answer the question at all. They were dead before anyone asked it. Their case notes filed in archives that nobody examined for 100 years. Their dependencies recorded as character flaws or cardiac failures, or simply not recorded at all. Their lives compressed into the census notation of invalid and left there. Alice Hargreaves, in her room in Islington in 1922, with the north-facing window and the gas lamp on the corner that nobody had fixed, was not thinking about any of this. She was 50 years old. She'd been dependent on opiates for 27 years. The law had changed twice in that time. The substance she was obtaining had changed form and name and legal status. Her body's relationship to it had not changed in any way that the changing laws had addressed. She was not waiting for a reckoning. She was waiting for the morning to become manageable. Whether it did, whether any morning after 1922 was manageable or less manageable or the last one, is not recorded anywhere that any researcher has found. That silence is its own kind of answer, and it is still not the question anyone has fully asked. The coroner's record for Clara Fenwick is still held in the London Metropolitan Archives, in a bound volume of 1893 inquest proceedings, on a shelf in a climate-controlled room that maintains a constant temperature of 61 degrees Fahrenheit. The entry is 11 lines long: name, age, address, occupation listed as wife, date of death, location, attending physician, cause, accidental poisoning. The coroner's name is written at the bottom in the careful, upright hand of a man who had filled out this form many times before and would fill it out many times again. In the space for additional remarks, the line is blank. Nothing more was considered necessary. The case was, by the standards of 1893, entirely unremarkable. The viewer who has spent the last 2 hours with this story reads those 11 lines differently now. Accidental. The word carries the whole architecture of what has been built across a century and a half. The deliberate exclusion from the Pharmacy Act, the industry lobbying, the suppressed committee reports, the medical journals funded by the same manufacturers whose products were filling the coroner's books, the diagnostic framework that turned women's distress into a condition requiring chemical management, the word non-addictive applied in succession to laudanum, to heroin, to barbiturates, to benzodiazepines, to OxyContin, each time by institutions that had access to data suggesting otherwise. Accidental. Nobody planned for Clara Fenwick to die in her drawing room at 34. Nobody planned anything. The system produced her death the way a river produces erosion, not through intention, but through the sustained application of pressure along the path of least resistance, year after year, until the ground gave way. Clara had purchased 3 bottles in 7 days. The chemist on Cheapside had sold them without question, without registration, without any legal obligation to do either, because the industry had ensured in 1868 that no such obligation would exist. The physician who had originally prescribed her laudanum, whose name does not appear in the inquest record, who was never called to testify, who faced no professional consequences of any kind, had done what Dr. Pembridge had done for Eleanor Marsh, and Dr. Lyle had done for Alice Hargreaves. He had given a woman in distress the fastest available intervention, and renewed it until the renewal became its own necessity. Clara's 3 bottles in 7 days suggest a tolerance built over months or years, a dose escalating toward the ceiling that the body cannot survive. They suggest someone who had been through this long enough to know exactly what she needed, and to feel the inadequacy of what she had. They suggest a story that began, as Eleanor's had, as Alice's had, as 2 to 4 million stories had, with a prescription written in good faith by a physician operating within the norms of his profession and the incentives of his era. The 3 bottles are the end of a story whose beginning is not in that drawing room. In 2022, a study published in the British Medical Journal examined prescribing data from National Health Service records across England between 2010 and 2020. The researchers were investigating gender disparities in opioid pain management. Their findings were specific and measurable. Women in the dataset were prescribed opioid painkillers at a statistically significant higher rate than men presenting with equivalent reported pain levels across a range of common chronic pain conditions. The same women were simultaneously less likely to have their pain assessed promptly in emergency settings, more likely to wait longer for analgesic intervention, and more likely to receive a psychological rather than physiological explanation for their pain in initial clinical assessments. The mechanism was different from 1872. The prescribing happened in a regulated environment with mandatory ingredient disclosure and documented informed consent procedures. The diagnostic framework had been transformed by a century of pharmacological and psychological science. The institutional relationships between pharmaceutical manufacturers and clinical practice were governed by conflict of interest policies that would have been unrecognisable to Dr. Pembridge or Dr. Lisle, and women were still being given opioids at higher rates for pain that was being taken less seriously. Still. The pattern that Earle documented in 1880, that the Select Committee documented in 1912, that William Wilcox calculated before the post-war inquiry, that the academic historians pieced together from Victorian case notes in the 1980s and 1990s, that pattern had not been resolved by regulation, or by the AMA's 1932 acknowledgement, or by the Harrison Act, or by the Dangerous Drugs Act, or by the OxyContin litigation, or by any of the institutional responses that had been constructed around it across 150 years. What had changed was the vocabulary. What had not changed was the direction of the current. Clara Fenwick was 34 years old. Her inquest lasted less than an hour. The chemist who sold her 3 bottles in 7 days was not called to testify. Nobody asked why the bottles were empty. The coroner called it accidental. He was right about one thing: nobody planned it. The manufacturer who lobbied the Pharmacy Act Committee in 1868 was not planning Clara Fenwick's death. The physician who wrote her first prescription was not planning her dependency. The chemist who sold the 3rd bottle of the final week was not planning to be the last link in a chain that had been constructed, link by link, across 3 centuries of medical practice, commercial interest, regulatory failure, and institutional decisions made by people who had, in almost every individual case, reasons that made sense within the framework available to them at the time. Nobody planned anything. That was exactly the problem, and it is the problem that the 11 blank lines at the bottom of the coroner's form could not contain, that the Harrison Act could not resolve, that the OxyContin settlement could not close, that the 2022 BMJ study found still operating in NHS data, 129 years after the ink dried on Clara Fenwick's inquest record. The brown glass bottle is gone. The label that said nothing about what was inside it is gone. Clara Fenwick is gone, and Eleanor Marsh, and Alice Hargreaves in her north-facing room in Islington, and the unnamed woman in Manchester standing at the factory door in 1841 with Godfrey's cordial on the shelf behind her, and the 2 to 4 million women whose dependencies were never named, and whose deaths were filed under other causes, and whose lives moved through the machinery of what happened, and left only the faintest marks in the records that survived. The pattern they were part of is not gone. It is in the prescribing data, in the clinical assessment disparities, in the distance between what medicine can do for women's pain and what it chooses to do, and what fills the gap between those 2 things, and what happens to the women who live in that gap for long enough. The story of laudanum does not end with laudanum. It ends with the question that every iteration of this story, in every decade, in every new pharmaceutical chapter, keeps arriving at and declining to answer with the directness the answer requires. Clara Fenwick's inquest record has a blank line at the bottom. It is still blank,